want to welcome you to the Penthouse Suite interviews. As you know, normally we do these interviews in the Penthouse Suite of the Francis Marion Hotel, but that's not possible. And we're doing the entire conference virtually, so we are, of course, doing these Penthouse Suite interviews virtually through the Zoom session. And we very much appreciate and want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk to us today. And we just want you to know how much we appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And thanks to you, Tom, and the conference committee for inviting me today. I'm really pleased to be talking with you. I'm excited about the upcoming panel and certainly the topic, but also the panelists. Mm-hmm. So a great opportunity to highlight this topic and talk about our speakers, who I think are going to do a wonderful job. I think the attendees are going to be really happy with this session. So that's great. That's great. Now your panel is going to be dealing and focusing on what you all see as the blurred lines between the traditional roles of bookstores and libraries on college campuses. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by blurred lines? And how is this impacting the relationship between libraries and bookstores? And what new challenges and opportunities does it pose for them? Well, you know, it's interesting. For years, the conference committee has had questions around this topic and requests from attendees for a topic of this type or a session of this type. And, you know, this year, finally, we got the opportunity to do it and we're able to recruit, I think, the right panelists who have a good perspective on this issue. It's interesting in the year of COVID because while this has been relevant for a while, with so many things moving remote and the changes we're dealing with, I think it's even more relevant. So all that said, I think to get back to answering your question, I think we're really dealing with traditional roles for bookstores and libraries on campuses. You know, the traditional use cases fairly linear, fairly well known by many folks. The bookstore provided an outlet for textbook purchases by individual students. The library in that traditional use case alongside providing support, reference material, perhaps some textbooks on reserve. And there was some overlap there, but pretty much two different use cases, both supporting the students and supporting them in their learning endeavors. And the students behaved accordingly. They would have a blend of, I'm going to buy these textbooks and I'm going to use the library for research, perhaps some reserve readings and support. I think even prior to COVID, what we saw changing, or some of the things we saw impacting these traditional use cases, were both technology-based and also some other additional outside forces. So certainly the Higher Education Opportunity Act coming in and giving students more latitude and more choice and more voice and how they bought their textbook materials and what options were available to them in purchasing those materials that they needed for their studies. I think even prior to COVID, we've seen emerging business models, specifically in the area of digital access, but also not necessarily digital more format, but open educational resources and different types of models. That's one example, but different types of models coming in, again, offering a diversity in the market. Both of those two things largely impacted by technology, the ability to make an ebook available for a student or the ability to make an open digital product available to a student. And then finally coming in, we definitely see the impact of changes in pedagogy and learning tools. I think faculty in a more technology-driven environment are really starting to embrace those sorts of tools. The speed at which they're doing that, again, perhaps accelerated by COVID, but definitely seeing a questioning of the faculty of how they're teaching, how their pedagogy can change to take advantage of these tools and offer better outcomes for their students.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you.
Meg, you were talking about the blurred lines and how they're evolving. Do you see any new partnerships emerging between libraries and bookstores? And conversely, is there any sort of resulting sense of competition between the two that might be problematic for their cooperation?
Well, I think we're definitely seeing many initiatives underway in this area on campuses. And I think they're varying to a large degree between smaller organic programs and more sophisticated programs. So things like the Open UCLA Affordable Textbook Materials Initiative, commercial companies like Flat World Knowledge, the Ohio Digital Bookshelf. So you're starting to see these initiatives, whether it's more word of mouth and organic or more formalized. So you're seeing new, things going on the campus, certainly, but then commercial and nonprofit companies coming into the space. So nothing holistic at this point, but things popping up. And again, this has been accelerated in the year of COVID for sure. Lisa Noctegal from Oxford University Press is one of our panelists. And definitely she is speaking to the need and the request from faculty to OUP directly for options and availability of e-learning materials and ebooks, because so many things have moved remote. So I think Lisa is definitely going to discuss from a publisher perspective, the increase in demand and how they're actually reacting to that, both from bookstores and libraries, and maybe starting to have those sorts of conversations. I think the thing that strikes me the most about this phenomenon and these questions that you asked, I think these collaborations have always been there to some degree. That you're talking about the three-legged stool, if you will. It's the library, the bookstore, and the faculty, and the student would be the top of that stool, and maybe even the publisher is the floor underneath. But I think what we're seeing now is these sorts of conversations happening more intentionally, and trying to build infrastructure that really does support all of these options and new, the new ways to deliver content, but then also the new ways to use content on campus. So I think hopefully we'll see more intentional conversations, and I think that that's going to be beneficial for everyone, most importantly, the students.
Meg, as you know, textbook affordability is a real issue on most college campuses. And we were wondering, are libraries and bookstores currently cooperating to bring down the cost of books and other learning materials? And if so, in what ways?
I think bookstores have done a good job of providing additional options to students and to purchasers. There's new books, there's used books. Rental certainly is a new business model that bookstores are supporting directly, whether physically in their stores or whether through online initiatives. And I think HEOA has been a big part of that transparency and offering those choices. So in many ways that can bring down the cost, making those options available. I think libraries specifically are drawing attention to open educational resource options. Again, we talked about some grassroots initiatives within the libraries to identify these kind of materials, but also more formal initiatives like I think Jennifer Chucks from UCLA is on the panel, and she's going to address that. She's very involved in those sorts of formal initiatives at UCLA. I think maybe what's missing, I talked about bookstores and libraries, and your question was bookstores and libraries. I think potentially what's missing in that equation, Tom, I would add, I talked about the stool, but to really be effective, I think you've got to include the faculty there, right? So they're the ones that really, I think libraries definitely have a role in vetting some of these materials that they make available to students, but really their partners in that are the faculty, deciding which materials are of value, which materials are going to be used in classes, which materials are going to be used as references or research tools. So I think that those three groups together, the bookstores, the library, and the faculty, can form a really powerful alliance. And that's where we're really going to start to see the impact.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an excellent point. Faculty are a major part of the equation. I agree with you.
Absolutely. Meg, is, many university bookstores are moving away from that traditional university-owned model, and in many cases have been assumed by outside commercial interests like Barnes & Noble, who bought our bookstore here at WKU. Do you see a challenge to the line of objectives of OER and the goal of textbook affordability with all of that?
Jack, I'm not a big fan of saying that when everything goes digital, user behavior and expectations instantaneously change. If you look at the traditional use cases, bookstores, as I talked about earlier, always sold those individual student textbooks. And libraries often had copies of those same books on the shelves intended to be shared as references. When I was an undergrad, I'm always very happy to say that I worked in the reserve room and had a up close and personal look at how important those ancillary readings and references were to the holistic learning environment that the faculty were putting together as part of their syllabi. So I'm more of a fan of thinking we'll see the same sorts of models emerge digitally. The bookstore and the library always existed side by side and served different needs in print. And I think we're going to see the same as digital access and products evolve. But maybe that's why the panel is called Blurred Lines, because in the past, we saw those two discrete use cases with pretty concrete overlap. Those lines are shifting, but I do think both in the past have held discrete value on the campus. And I think that that's going to continue. How they fit together, I think, is more TBD. The constant thing here, though, I will say, is the desire for the students to pay as little as possible for those textbook materials. Now, I'm not sure, that's not a topic for our panel, and I'm not sure how to get around that. And that may be a better question for perhaps the publisher, who is really in charge of defining and building value into their products. I talked with the publisher not too long ago, and doing some market research with the students, and they said, what we discovered was students hate our textbooks. We've been writing our textbooks for the faculty. Right. And once we started talking more intimately with the students, we started getting a better understanding of how they learn. So I think, that definitely is a piece of the puzzle here. But students definitely are looking, they want value. They understand value. They're consumers of that type. And I think that's going to help define how all of these folks work together to support them and get better outcomes.
I know years ago we went to a meeting with the bookstore. We were trying to deal with the textbook issue even that far back, because many of our students would report that they simply couldn't continue school because they couldn't afford the textbook costs.
Right.
And at that time, our bookstore reminded us that we had a non-competitive agreement with them and that we couldn't really step into that role. I noticed that has changed. I'm sure you have too. Those lines are blurring out of mutual self-interest.
Right. And I do think specifically for libraries, and again, this is not necessarily what my panel is going to address, although I really looking forward to their comments, and maybe this will come up. But there are funding questions that come into play specifically for libraries. I think in many ways, libraries and bookstores can be great gatekeepers, but as some of these models start to evolve, something's got to give. Specifically for libraries, I would point in terms of how they're tasked, but how they're also funded.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Meg, what role do you think open access is going to play in this evolving relationship between bookstores and libraries? And more specifically, can you give us a hint or an idea of how bookstores are reacting to library promotion of OER materials?
Well, I'm not sure we see a reaction specifically from bookstores about OER, although on the panel, we're going to have Richard Hirschman from the National Association of College Stores participating on the Blurred Lines panel. So I think he'll be able to speak to this because this is his bread and butter every day. I do think that we see bookstores trying to evolve, certainly, and continue to meet the needs of students. I think the implementation of the HEOA guidelines has been a big part of that in terms of them providing that kind of transparency. Mm-hmm. I absolutely think we see a role for libraries, as I mentioned earlier, in identifying and vetting OER material. I think libraries are well positioned to collaborate with faculty to do that. And that definitely can support the students' needs, but also the research needs. How these two roles match up, specifically with regard to OER, I think is TBD, but that's a topic that I can tell you the panel is definitely going to address, and I think address very effectively.
Thank you.
Meg, what impact, if any, do you see on the emergence of OER and the commercialization of the traditional university bookstore on the role of the economic future of the university press?
Well, Jack, aside from some very well-known and famous co-ops or coops, however you want to say that, it was, very famously coop at one big university and co-op at another big university. These bookstores have largely always been commercial enterprises, even prior to the prevalence of lease operators in the market. So I'm not sure that that's, the commercial aspect of academic retail has changed all that significantly. But what I would say is that a good local bookstore is always about its community and its customers. So a campus affiliated store, I think, by extension, should be about local authors and publications, which in academia goes directly to the university press. I know my alma mater had a specialty at the university press in Irish American literature, and those titles were always very prominent, not only in the library as a collection, but also in the bookstore. So I think that that's the connection if you're going to be a good local bookstore. And I think, again, with the rise of online competition for bookstores, they've had to be more engaged locally, and that can go directly to the university presses, but it can also come back to the topic of the panel, which is how can the bookstore be more participatory with the library and the faculty, engaging in that mission of supporting those students so they can get the best learning outcomes possible. To be honest, I think a bigger threat, and maybe Richard will speak about this at the panel, but I think a bigger threat to bookstores in many ways is the emergence of the business model of included access, where you see, through some sort of funding model, typically a flat fee to the student as part of their tuition, access to their academic materials included in that. Depending on how that goes, I think that that's a threat to the bookstore. I also think it could be very harmful and disintermediating to the libraries as well. So that's a very interesting model that we see emerging. We haven't talked about it this afternoon, specifically on the interview, but I think that that's potentially more disruptive than a lot of other factors that we're seeing emerge right now.
That's great. Thank you.
Meg, we're going to ask you to play fortune teller before we let you go, and I'll ask you to gaze into your crystal ball. And what do you see as the future opportunities and pitfalls for libraries and bookstores as the lines blur and as they work to hopefully cooperate? Well,
Tom, if 2020's taught us anything, it's that crystal balls are made to be broken. So I'm going to push it right off the desk, right? Right? And here we are virtually. But I do think that entities who remain focused on their core competency will continue to be relevant. So, that the roles, I think, may look different. They may interact differently within the academic community. But I think that if you focus on that core competency and building that out, I think you're still going to have a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. So bookstores, libraries, and I would add publishers to the mix. They're all about ensuring that the scholarly enterprise has the resources needed to do their work. So as long as learning is going on and these entities continue to respond to the needs of the learners and faculty, I think they'll have a seat at the table. Again, I think it's more about now, and I'm going to recommend an article here. Again, we're seeing these kinds of initiatives and partnerships grow up sort of organically. But I think the communication and intentional communication is going to be important. Sort of snapping your fingers or closing your eyes and wishing these kinds of partnerships and collaborations into existence is not a way to go. But recently, OCLC published a study, Social Interoperability in Research Support, Cross-Campus Partnerships and the University Research Enterprise. Now, this wasn't specific to textbooks, but it definitely calls out, as you might imagine, the library. And it specifically gives a framework for starting these conversations. And so it's not one-to-one germane with our discussion specifically of textbook materials in the bookstore, the library, the faculty, but it does absolutely attempt to define how you can intentionally start to have these conversations. So I think that with COVID, certainly these things are accelerating, and it gives, this report gives you, it's a stake in the sand, if you will, to be intentional about defining how this is going to look moving forward. But I think, so many things are about core competency, and certainly the disruption, you hear it all the time, that technology can bring, offers opportunity if folks stay really focused on what is their real value and what are they bringing to the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we need to be flexible as far as I can tell. We do need to be able to and hopefully collaborate and cooperate with one another, realizing that our mission is pretty much the same: to educate students and provide them with materials that they can use to learn. So, and I think that's going to come out in your panel discussion, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to hearing you all speak about it.
I would say, and again, we're fortunate enough, I mentioned Richard Hirschman from the National Association of College Stores, Jennifer Chucks from the UCLA Libraries, and Lisa Nachtigal from Oxford University Press. So I've talked a lot today. I'm going to get out of the way and let those three folks take the ball, and I'm really looking forward to that Neapolitan. It's Thursday afternoon, I believe at 12:30. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, so am I. Again, Meg, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk with us today. I've learned an awful lot, and it's just made me more interested in attending the panel. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Meg.
Jack and Tom, always great to see your smiling faces. Be well, and I know we'll talk soon.
All right.
Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.